The letter arrived at the Canadian High Commission in Washington on a Thursday afternoon in late April. It was not a diplomatic note in the traditional sense. No formal seal, no bilingual preamble, no courtesy language softening its edges. It was by the account of 3 senior Canadian officials speaking to the Globe and Mail. A statement of American intent so direct that one senior diplomat described reading it as watching a door close. The letter made plain that the United States was not prepared to recognize the principle of Canadian economic sovereignty in any renegotiation of the framework governing trade between the two countries. Tariffs on Canadian goods, steel, aluminum, automotive components, softwood lumber, dairy would remain, and the administration was signaling they could go higher. Mark Carney read the summary that evening, and then, according to reporting by Stephanie Carvalho at the Financial Times, he made a phone call, not to Washington, not to the State Department, not to the Office of the United States Trade Representative. He called London. That call, and what followed from it in the next 72 hours, is the story this script is about. Because what Canada did next was not a protest. It was not a press release. It was not a carefully worded expression of concern from a junior partner to a dominant ally. It was a strategic repositioning of a G7 nation. Deliberate, historically grounded, and executed with a speed that left several senior figures inside the White House genuinely surprised. There is a specific clause inside the framework Carney's team began drafting in the days after that phone call. A clause governing trade settlement currency that I will return to later in this script because it carries implications well beyond the Canada-US file. But first, the man himself, Mark Carney, is 60 years old. He grew up in Fort Smith, Northwest Territories, studied economics at Harvard, earned his doctorate at Oxford, and spent 13 years at Goldman Sachs before entering public service. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada from 2008 to 2013. The years that included the global financial crisis, and then did something no Canadian central banker had ever done. He was appointed governor of the Bank of England, a post he held from 2013 to 2020. He navigated Brexit's financial turbulence from the inside. He sat in rooms where sovereign decisions were made under genuine pressure, not theoretical pressure. He is not a politician who studied economics. He is an economist who became a politician, and the distinction matters enormously for understanding what happened after that Thursday letter. When Carney entered federal politics and led the Liberal Party to its April 2025 election victory, a victory that defied the polling consensus as recently as February, he carried with him a specific kind of institutional credibility that no Canadian Prime Minister since Pierre Trudeau had possessed in foreign financial circles. The governors of the Bank of England do not forget who sat across from them for 7 years. Neither do the finance ministers of the G7. That credibility became operational the moment Washington's letter arrived. Here is where the historical pattern becomes unmistakable. In August of 1971, President Richard Nixon closed the gold window. He ended the convertibility of the US dollar to gold, effectively dismantling the Bretton Woods system that had governed the international monetary order since 1944. The announcement was made on a Sunday evening with no advance notice to America's allies. Canadian Finance Minister Edgar Benson learned of the decision from a news broadcast. The following morning, Ottawa faced a choice: absorb the shock inside the existing framework, or begin building alternative arrangements. Canada chose initially to absorb. It took nearly a decade before the structural vulnerabilities of that dependence became fully visible in the stagflation and commodity price dislocations of the late 1970s. Carney knows that history with a specificity that most politicians do not. He wrote about the structural fragility of single market dependence in his 2021 book, Values: Building a Better World for All, noting, in language that now reads as prophetic, that nations which allow their trade settlement architecture to be governed entirely by a single counterparty's currency and regulatory framework have, in effect, made a sovereign bet on that counterparty's continued restraint. When restraint ends, the adjustment is not gradual. It is sudden. The Nixon shock of 1971 is not a perfect analogy for what is happening now, but it is the closest structural parallel in the post-war record. And Carney's team has been explicit in background briefings reported by John Ivison at the National Post that the 1971 precedent is one of several historical reference points the Prime Minister's office has been actively consulting. The phone call to London was followed within 48 hours by calls to Paris, Berlin, Tokyo, and, crucially, Brussels. What Carney was assembling was not a coalition of complaint. It was a coalition of alternative architecture. The specific proposal that emerged from those calls, reported in outline by Leah Schnur at Reuters on May 6, 2025, involved three components. First, an accelerated timeline for Canada-EU trade expansion under the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement known as CETA, moving priority sectors ahead of their originally scheduled implementation dates. Second, a bilateral currency swap arrangement with the Bank of England, the institution Carney formerly led, designed to reduce Canadian exporters' exposure to U.S. dollar settlement requirements on non-American trade. Third, and most significantly, a proposal to expand the use of Canadian dollar settlement in commodity trade with Japan and South Korea, two of Canada's largest Pacific partners. That third component is the clause I mentioned at the beginning of this script. It is two paragraphs inside a framework document that Carney's trade team circulated to G7 partners in the first week of May. The second paragraph reads, in the language reported by the Financial Times, parties agreed to explore bilateral settlement mechanisms that reduce transaction exposure to third-party currency volatility in the context of ongoing trade reorientation. The language is careful. It is deliberately not a declaration. But every finance ministry that received it understood what it meant. It meant that Canada was beginning formally, in writing, at the G7 level, the process of reducing the gravitational pull of U.S. dollar settlement on its non-American trade relationships. This is the part of the story that most television coverage missed entirely. If you have found this analysis useful, a subscription ensures you receive the next dispatch as soon as it publishes. This channel does not chase the news cycle. It explains the architecture beneath it. The reaction inside the White House was, by multiple accounts, not the dismissive shrug that a smaller country's reorientation might have received. Canada is not a small country in the terms that matter here. It is the United States' largest trading partner by volume. It supplies roughly 60% of U.S. crude oil imports. It provides the aluminum that goes into American military aircraft and the softwood lumber that goes into American housing. The relationship is not one of American generosity toward a dependent neighbor. It is structural interdependence. And the American side of that interdependence is, in several critical sectors, more exposed than the political rhetoric of the past 18 months has acknowledged. General Rhett David Petraeus, speaking at the Aspen Security Forum in early May 2025, addressed the broader pattern of allied repositioning with the kind of directness that his post-military career has made characteristic. He said, when you pressure allies to the point where they begin building institutional alternatives, you have not demonstrated strength. You have demonstrated the cost of association with you. And the allies who are watching, and they are all watching, draw their own conclusions. Petraeus was not speaking about Canada specifically. But 3 journalists in the room filed the quote in stories that were explicitly about Ottawa's moves. The general's words traveled. The White House's internal response, reported by Alex Thompson at Axios on May 9, involved what Thompson described as genuine frustration at the speed of the Canadian repositioning, particularly the currency swap arrangement with the Bank of England. One senior administration official, speaking on background, said, "We expected a press conference. We got a structural play." That sourced characterization, a structural play, is worth holding on to. Let me introduce a second named figure whose presence in this story carries weight that the surface coverage has largely ignored. Christine Lagarde, President of the European Central Bank and former managing director of the International Monetary Fund, has been watching the Canada file with an attention that goes beyond the ordinary. In an April 30 speech at the European University Institute in Florence, a speech reported by Martin Arnold at the Financial Times, Lagarde said, "The fragmentation of the global trade order is not a risk scenario. It is a current condition. Institutions and nations that recognize this early and adapt their settlement architecture accordingly will retain sovereignty over their economic choices. Those that do not will find that sovereignty has quietly migrated elsewhere." She did not name Canada. She did not need to. By the following morning, 3 separate European Finance Ministry officials had shared the quote in private communications with Ottawa, according to reporting by David Youngren at Reuters. Lagarde's framing matters because it comes from the person who has arguably the most comprehensive view of global monetary architecture currently held by any active policymaker. She ran the IMF during the Greek crisis, the Chinese currency liberalization debate, and the early years of the Belt and Road's financial mechanics. When she says settlement architecture determines sovereignty, she is speaking from a record, not a theory. And the record she is speaking from includes the last time a G7 adjacent nation attempted this kind of deliberate trade reorientation, the United Kingdom's post-Brexit repositioning, which Carney watched from the inside of the Bank of England for the first 4 years of its turbulent execution. He knows exactly what works in that process and what does not. He watched the pound fall. He watched the gilt market seize. He watched the political promises of alternative trade architecture collide with the slower reality of institutional negotiation. He is not repeating those errors. The difference between Brexit and Canada's current move is foundational. Brexit was a departure from an existing framework driven by political pressure and executed without a prepared alternative architecture. Canada's repositioning is an expansion of existing frameworks. CETA is already in force. The Bank of England relationship is institutional. The Pacific trade relationships are mature, executed by a man who spent 20 years inside the rooms where monetary architecture is actually built. Here is where this story reaches into your own financial life, and I want to be direct about it. The trade relationship between Canada and the United States touches prices you pay every week. Canadian softwood lumber prices feed directly into American housing construction costs. And if those supply chains are disrupted or rerouted, the effect is not abstract. Canadian crude oil at 60% of American import volume is a number that sits upstream of every gasoline price you have seen at the pump for the past 2 years. If Canada begins structuring longer-term supply commitments toward Pacific partners, a scenario that is not current policy, but is now a documented contingency, reported by Gwynne Guilford at the Wall Street Journal on May 7. The downstream effect on American energy prices is material. For Canadian viewers, and this channel has a substantial Canadian audience, the personal stakes are different in character, but equally real. What Carney is attempting is a fundamental rebalancing of Canada's trade exposure, reducing the percentage of GDP that is hostage to a single bilateral relationship. If it succeeds, the Canadian dollar becomes a more independent monetary instrument. Canadian pension funds with large U.S. equity exposure gain, a government that is actively building non-U.S. economic ballast. And Canadian exporters in energy, agriculture, and advanced manufacturing gain access to settlement arrangements that do not require them to absorb U.S. dollar volatility as a cost of doing business. If it fails, and the risks are real, the short-term disruption to the existing U.S.-Canada trade flow could be severe. Reorientation of trade architecture takes years. The political window for executing it is months. Carney knows this. His entire professional life has been preparation for exactly this kind of constrained decision environment. The major authority reset on this story belongs to Robert Zoellick. Zoellick served as United States Trade Representative under President George W. Bush, as Deputy Secretary of State, and as President of the World Bank from 2007 to 2012. He negotiated trade frameworks on 4 continents. He is now a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard. In a May 8 essay published in Foreign Affairs, the full text is available at Foreign Affairs. Zoellick wrote with the measured precision of someone who has sat on both sides of every negotiating table this story involves. He wrote, "The United States has spent 75 years constructing a trade and monetary architecture in which allied nations voluntarily situated their economic interests within the American-led framework. That voluntary quality was the architecture's strength. Allies chose it because the terms were reliable and the relationship was predictable. The moment reliability is withdrawn and predictability is replaced by leverage, the voluntary quality of the architecture begins to dissolve." Canada's current positioning is not anti-American. It is a rational institutional response to the withdrawal of the conditions that made the original positioning rational. Washington should understand this distinction clearly, because misreading it will accelerate precisely the Allied realignment it wishes to prevent. That paragraph is worth reading twice. Zoellick is not a critic of American trade power. He built much of it. When he writes that Washington risks accelerating the realignment it wishes to prevent, he is offering the kind of counsel that arrives rarely and matters enormously. And based on the reporting from Axios and the National Post, it is not reaching the decision makers who most need to hear it. The second authority voice in this story, Carney himself, speaking not as Prime Minister, but as a former central banker, came in his first formal press availability after the framework document began circulating. He said, in language reported verbatim by the CBC on May 10, "Canada's goal is not confrontation. Our goal is resilience. Resilience means ensuring that no single relationship, however valued, carries the full weight of our economic future." It was 12 words that every finance ministry in the G7 had already internalized. Coming from Carney in public, they were the confirmation that this was policy, not posture. Let us trace the cascade of consequences from that confirmation outward. The immediate market reaction was specific and measurable. The Canadian dollar strengthened 1.4% against the US dollar in the 48 hours following the Reuters report on the framework document. Canadian government bond yields tightened modestly, reflecting reduced perceived trade risk. Aluminum and lumber futures showed limited movement. The market was reading this as a long-term structural shift, not an immediate supply disruption. The regional response arrived in two forms. Mexico, watching from its own difficult position inside USMCA renegotiation pressure, sent signals through diplomatic back channels, reported by Natalie Kitchreff at the New York Times, that it was monitoring Canada's currency arrangement exploration with considerable interest. Australia and New Zealand, both of which have their own bilateral trade pressure points with Washington, made no public statement, but increased the frequency of their embassy-level contacts with Ottawa. According to reporting by Daniel Hurst at The Guardian, the diplomatic and institutional response has been the most significant lagging indicator. The European Commission's Trade Directorate issued a statement on May 11 describing the C-to-C acceleration as consistent with the union's established trade expansion objectives. That is bureaucratic language for, we are on board and we are not going to advertise it. The IMF's spring statement, released the same week, contained a paragraph 9, if you are reading the full text, noting that trade settlement diversification among open economies represents a stabilizing force in conditions of bilateral trade stress. The paragraph was not written about Canada, but it was written in the week that Canada's framework document was circulating. The long-term strategic consequence is where this story finds its full weight. The post-war trade order was built on a foundation of reliable American engagement. Not perfect engagement, not frictionless engagement. The history is full of tariffs, quotas, and trade disputes, but engagement that operated within a recognized framework of rules that all parties had agreed to honor. What has changed in the past 18 months is not the presence of American trade pressure. That has always existed. What has changed is the predictability of the framework itself. When allies can no longer predict the rules, they build their own rules. And when they build their own rules, the American leverage that depended on their preference for the existing framework begins to erode. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Gradually, institutionally, in the language of currency swap agreements and CETA acceleration timelines and commodity settlement paragraphs. The erosion is quiet, but it is real, and it compounds. Robert Zuelick understood this when he wrote his foreign affairs essay. Christine Lagarde understood it when she spoke in Florence. David Petraeus understood it when he said allies draw their own conclusions. The question, and it is the question this story ultimately turns on, is whether the current administration in Washington understands it. Return for a moment to that Thursday afternoon in late April. The letter at the Canadian High Commission. The summary Carney read that evening. The phone call to London. The door that one Canadian diplomat described as closing was, in that diplomat's reading, the door to the old architecture, the arrangement Canada had operated inside since 1965, since the Auto Pact, since the Free Trade Agreement of 1988, since NAFTA in 1994, since USMCA in 2020. Each of those agreements was built on the premise that the United States and Canada shared a mutual interest in a predictable framework. The premise held for 60 years. What Carney appears to have concluded with the specific analytical precision of a man who spent 2 decades in central banking is that the premise no longer holds with sufficient reliability to bear the full weight of Canada's economic sovereignty. And so he is distributing that weight to London, to Brussels, to Tokyo and Seoul, to the institutional architecture of a world that still exists alongside the bilateral one, and that's, given sufficient political will and institutional competence, can be strengthened. Whether he succeeds will depend on factors that no individual, however prepared, fully controls the pace of European decision-making, the durability of the Pacific trade relationships, the reaction of American markets to Canadian supply reorientation, and ultimately, whether Washington recalibrates before the alternative architecture becomes self-sustaining.